Chapter 10, Child Abuse and Neglect. So abuse is any maltreatment in which a child is not safe in his or her environment because of injury inflicted by caretakers, exposure to hazardous conditions resulting in inadequate protection or resulting from inadequate protection, exploitation, withholding medical treatment, and then neglect is the failure to properly care for and meet the child's basic needs. So children have been viewed as adult property with no rights or privileges historically. In 1874, New York Society for Prevention of Cruelty of Animals protected an adopted child using their animal cruelty laws. In 1961, battered children syndrome or battered child syndrome was announced at a research conference to bring attention to child abuse issues. And then finally, in 1974, in the United States, the CAPTA Act was passed, a Child Abuse and Prevention Act. It was passed again. It was reauthorized in 1996 and 2003. And we have a National Center on Child Abuse and Neglect. So approximately 600,000 confirmed cases of child maltreatment or abuse and neglect occur in the U.S. This is from 2011. 5 children die every day from child abuse. 50% of these children are under the age of 5. The actual incidence of child abuse is estimated to be 3 times greater than reported. So approximately 230,000 children are placed in foster care each year, and that's what tends to happen if a child has been victimized. They're taken from their home and placed in foster care. Victimized children are more likely to engage in drug abuse, juvenile crime, become pregnant, experience depression and other mental health disorders, and commit suicide as they grow up because of the trauma of being a child abuse and neglect victim. They are also at greater risk for performing poorly in school, repeating at least one grade, and requiring special education services. We also need to remember that child abuse and neglect are children suffering from child abuse and neglect are victims, and that they have certain rights just as adult victims. And so the State of California Department of Justice Victim Services Unit, there is information available on the website provided on this page. So some ways that we can support victims is to participate in the National Children's Advocacy Centers, which originally was located in Huntsville, Alabama. And this revolutionized in the United States our response to child abuse. And it led to the establishment of children's advocacy centers, and sometimes they're called children's justice centers. And you can find more information on the web page located on this slide. So the challenge of child abuse and neglect is revolves around moral and ethical dilemmas of families' rights versus the laws and the rights of the victim. Abusive treatment is often a continuum between trying to provide guidance in regards to what society deems as appropriate behavior or discipline, and then taking that discipline too far, and then it becomes abuse. So really, The historical definition of discipline is teaching and guiding appropriate behavior, and the word actually comes from disciple. Today, unfortunately, though, punishment is the way we interpret discipline, and in fact, we've added punishment into our dictionary as a definition of discipline because currently we use punishment as our one and only technique. And really, we should be exploring, there are many other options besides punishment, and especially physical punishment. It's easy to get carried away, and then it becomes abuse. So something to keep in mind about punishment is that the focus is not on appropriate behavior, but it's on inappropriate behavior. And many times a child is not even informed about what is appropriate behavior. It's often used inappropriately. It's used to create fear, to make threats, and then physical punishment, as we just mentioned, is very likely to end up being physical abuse. So on page 278 of your book, it gives us some examples of discipline techniques that have a more positive approach focusing on appropriate behavior. So for example, reinforcement. With operant conditioning and its reinforcement approach, what you do is you look for appropriate behavior, and then you add something that the person likes when the appropriate behavior occurs. And that's positive reinforcement. Negative reinforcement, you take away something the individual does not like when they behave appropriately. That is not punishment. Sometimes people get negative reinforcement confused with punishment. Let's look more closely at the punishment technique. And just to emphasize that negative reinforcement is not the same. So punishment focuses on inappropriate behavior, and often, as we mentioned before, there's no information provided about what is appropriate. With punishment, we add something to the individual that the individual does not like when inappropriate behavior occurs, and we take away something the individual likes when inappropriate behavior occurs. So you can see that negative reinforcement is the opposite of punishment. Categories of abuse and neglect. There's physical abuse, and an example pictured here is shaken baby syndrome, where a frustrated adult shakes a baby to get them to behave appropriately and can cause severe brain damage and death. There's sexual abuse and emotional or verbal abuse, and then neglect, both physical and emotional. And on page 272 of your text, it lists some of the signs that a child is being abused or neglected. So the more information about the categories. Physical abuse is unexplained physical injuries, and children may appear frightened, aggressive, withdrawn, or apprehensive in regards to physical contact. Sexual abuse is any sexual act performed for adult pleasure, including inappropriate touching, physical contact, or indecent exposure. And a child may have excessive curiosity or advanced sexual knowledge for their age as a result of sexual abuse. Emotional or verbal abuse. This is excessive and repeated name-calling, belittling, or other negative remarks, and unfortunately this is the hardest one to prove. Children may appear anxious, have persistent fears, sleep disturbances, and behavior problems. Physical neglect. This is a failure to meet a child's basic needs and protection from harm, and the child may comment about an absent caregiver. Emotional neglect. This is a lack of interest or responsiveness to a child's psychological needs and development, and a child suffering from this type of neglect may appear afraid and distrustful of others. So if we were to depict pictorially dynamics of abuse, we start with an adult's predisposition, move to a vulnerable child, and add stress, and this could lead to abuse. So some characteristic of adult perpetrators of child abuse and neglect. Most cases involve someone the child knows and trusts. 4 out of 5 victims are abused by at least one parent, more often the mother. They may also be other family members or a relative, babysitter, or neighbor. Those adult perpetrators often experience acute or chronic environmental stress from poverty, relationship problems, unemployment. They may live in social isolation or lack outside support. They lack knowledge about children's development and raising children, and may have very unreasonable expectations and not have skills to draw upon. They were abused themselves as children, and they may be using or abusing alcohol and other substances. So vulnerable children, there's no group of children that are immune to abuse and neglect. Boys and girls experience maltreatment in almost equal numbers, although girls are 4 times more likely to be sexually abused and boys are more likely to be neglected. Children under ages 3 to 4 are the most vulnerable, just because they're so much more dependent, and children who have disabilities are at high risk. So considering all of this information, who is required to report? Well, there is a list of mandated reporters, and you can find more information about this on page 281. Teachers and early childhood personnel are required to report child abuse and neglect. Medical professionals, social workers, law enforcement, and any person with reason to suspect a child has been injured by physical, emotional, or sexual abuse or neglect. But the important thing is to remember that if you're a mandated reporter, you need to be educated and thoughtful in your reporting. So whenever an opportunity arises to find out more, even though it's not a desirable topic, you should get as much training as possible in child abuse and neglect. Go to conferences, take courses, read information about that topic so you're as informed as possible, and then use that information to thoughtfully report under the mandated reporting. So our goal in regards to child abuse and neglect is prevention, because once child abuse and neglect has happened, you can't go back. There can be physiological and cognitive issues that we cannot intervene for. And so provide quality care and education in a family-focused program, develop reciprocal relationships with families, recognize risks and signs of abuse and neglect, build on child and family strengths, be informed about professional responsibilities, and help children develop resiliency skills.